incredibly busy lately. I love talking about stuff nobody else talks about. I love discovery. Wisdom is its own reward. Absolutely love that. Doesn't pay the bills, but I was doing leather work and building stuff and fixing stuff. That's what pays the bills, right? There's a neat book here. It's called Causality, Electromagnetic Induction, and Gravitation. I got a couple copies of it. Completely worn it out. It's a professor and doctor, actually, also. 2 PhDs, Dr. Oleg Jefemenko. Incredibly brilliant guy. He wrote a really, really great book on learning about equations regarding field theory. Here it is. You can actually find this online. All the stuff that's underlined, my book is actually falling apart since I've been through it so many times. Right here, and he emphasizes it over and over again on page 16, and he's referring to James Clerk Maxwell. It says, equations, solutions don't indicate the existence of causal links between electrical and magnetic fields. Of course, electricity is a hybrid of dielectricity and magnetism, and electrostatics and magnetic field is required in the circuit that makes up electricity. But these are a conjugate. They are an inseparable, not a binary, but a unity. Principle and attribute, of course, wouldn't be a binary. That's like some fool thinking, well, a magnet has a north pole and a south pole. Actually, that's the extrapolation of the three-dimensional force vector that actually makes up magnetism. But here is the magnet. The fact that we call it a magnet, it has a field ab extra to it, which, of course, has fascinated humanity since the dawn of time, but there is not a duality in saying a magnet, has a north pole and a south pole. It actually has the inverse of counterspace. When this is present, that is present. Humanity fundamentally, seemingly so, from my perspective anyway, can't wrap its mind around the fact that when there's a release of energy, you necessitatively not only have something else that's slightly different, kind of like when you remove the temperature out of water, you end up with this hard water, which is almost like a stone if you throw it at somebody's head, but it has another property to it, and the same is true of the release of energy. You actually have this three-dimensional force vector that makes up a voluminous volume, i.e. the torus, but what's making up the air inside the balloon of the torus of magnetism? When this is present, that is present. So Dr. Oleg Jefemenko, I think I got leather dust in my lungs, yeah? Sanding a lot of leather today. He's talking about sourceless electromagnetic fields, and that the fact that none of the scientists to date, other than himself, has recognized the fact that there is no point in causation. And actually that's quite humorous, because there's no causation in the principle of emanationism. Emanationism is the metaphysics behind Pythagoras, Plato, Proclus, Plotinus, Numenius, Syrianus, Advaita Vedanta, original Buddhism, on and on and on. According to these equations in time-variable systems, electromagnetic fields are always created simultaneously. Once created, the two fields coexist from then on without any effect upon one another. Anyway, he is scratching his head throughout this entire book, this very, very brilliant gentleman with 2 PhDs, and what he can't understand, and what is divinely simple, because Mother Nature's divinely simple, is this is a conjugate system. By the way, and speaking about so-called fields and talking about protons, and I want to talk about antimatter and destructive interference. Like in the case of lasers or regular light, we can have constructive interference, where two light sources of X intensity or lux will actually amplify one another. But what happens to the light energy where it's destructive? This thing that we actually call antimatter is nothing other than inverse phase matter. It's not like there's some sort of bizarro particle that, and that's actually how these folks of quantum will do and write about antimatter. So, well, this antimatter explosion, we think we've seen it in Hubble Space Telescope, and we know antimatter is real because it's actually been created as a byproduct of CERN and other particle, what's the other one? There's CERN, and there's the particle accelerator that's underneath Italy. No, it's between Switzerland and Austria. That's CERN. There's 2 major particle accelerators. Anyway, we know that antimatter is real, but it is not antimatter. It's just inverse phase matter, mutual cancellation. super high energy light, as I've said many times, I predicted this years ago, and it's finally discovered 2 years ago. You could look that up, where phased lasers, when they're destructive interference, would actually generate fundamental matter, i.e. hydrogen. So that which we call antimatter is just inverse phase matter. Whatever the case, people think incorrectly. And of course, I've never denied particles. I've actually attacked atomism. Atomism is a belief system. And if you're a hammer, everything is a nail. And if you're a so-called scientist, which is not a scientist by true Aristotelian definition, what these people are mathematicians. They think everything is a particle, and they don't believe in anything that can't be counted. I've never denied nucleoparticles. It is an established fact, once again, that all free neutrons turn into protons after what's been established to be roughly 17 minutes. That being the case, at which all parties agree, this means, of course, there's only one fundamental particle. But that fundamental particle, even though it is a nucleoparticle, is not some sort of like BB, that is has any actual existence. What if a so-called proton, and all neutrons become protons once they're free, therefore a neutron is nothing other than a proton modality, just as antimatter is not some sort of inversion of matter, because when you say antimatter, you think of something that's totally the opposite. What it is not totally the opposite, it's just inverse phase matter, and of course when they collide, an enormous amount of energy is released, and they mutually cancel each other out, but that's not different than destructive interference in the case of light, or the so-called famous dual slit experiment. What if the case, if a proton is thought accurately to be, in the case of understanding fields, is they're just like field terminals. Like I've got a 12-volt lead-acid 150 amp hour battery over there, weighs like 72 pounds, is absolutely heavy as hell. That which we call a proton is no different than a battery terminal. At the center of any atom, just say the hydrogen atom, for example, we're looking at a battery terminal. So we actually have a spherical frequency dielectric condensate, spherical frequency, which is, of course, is what scientists actually accurately call a ZTP, or a zero-time particle, exists for a certain period of time. According to this, it's nearly indefinite, and of course all matter is compounded hydrogen. And by definition of the person who discovered it, the so-called electron discovered by J.J. Thomson, which he himself said was not a particle, but that's what we have today because these scientists are atomists. It's just, as he said, 1 unit of dielectric induction. It's not a particle at all, so even at the most fundamental level, the so-called proton is nothing other than a field terminal, just like a terminal on a battery. The energy on the battery, analogously, to use the field terminal relative to the battery, it doesn't have anything in itself. But what if we could only see the terminals of a battery? It's like, well, we know we have this unit of induction. If I attach something here, or if I, bring something into contact with it, we have this energy transference or loss of energy. The actual energy is underneath the terminal. The terminal itself is just the terminal of the battery. The actual energy of the system is in the substrate underneath the terminal. That huge block of lead and distilled water and acid. It's kind of a pretty perfect analogy. So a proton is just a field terminal. But at no point in time have I ever denied particles. So antimatter, to make Mother Nature really simple, because Mother Nature's a hairy armpit chick, and she's really, really, really simple, is just inverse phase matter. One of the things that AC generators were burning themselves out, we have Nikola Tesla, of course, invented the specific arch form, which is the AC generator. And by the way, an AC generator doesn't generate electricity, it manifests it. But a so-called AC generator, as I've said many times, is just an inside-out magnet where the magnetic field's on the inside and the plane of inertia, the dielectric reflector, is on the outside. Anyway, these generators would burn themselves up. And Charles Proteus Steinmetz, just like the AC lines are in the backyard of your house for power current, he discovered the way to keep these from burning themselves out, and it's kind of ingenious. And this ties into lightning, and this ties into destructive interference. In the case of light, to keep these AC generators from self-destroying, he used, and you can look this up, how AC generators were perfected so they'd be usable systems, is he laminated the steel. And by laminating the steel, you can actually see this if you take apart a small AC motor in a little remote car or something like that. You can see the steel lamination. Is that there's a hysteresis cycle wherein the actual electric field and specifically the magnetism, the current thereof of the AC generator was burning the motors out. The laminated steel was used to guide the magnetic field relative to the amperage of the circuit. A circuit, of course, of the AC generator, electricity, is the circuit of dielectricity and magnetism, which are not two different things, but the conjugate substrate of the entire universe. Like, why were these... I don't know how Charles Purdy Steinmetz figured that out, but he did. It might have been through experimentation. It might have been due to his incredibly sharp mind that this laminated steel guided the field rather than the magnetism being lost into the interatomic structure of the steel itself, because the AC generators were literally dumping the energy into themselves rather than, which all AC generators today follow this principle to guide the field structure of the electrical circuit. Isn't that kind of genius, laminating the steel to make up the AC motor? Because you want to guide the energy rather than have it being dissipated into itself. Basically, an AC generator is a low voltage, low amperage relative to lightning, for example, energy circuit, but you don't want it to be lost in the actual generator, like lightning will blast something into oblivion. Look, I got some some sewing machine thread here from our sewing wallets. It's like, what's that fuzz sitting a sewing machine thread there? I'll edit that out of this video. It's like, what was that? It's like, oh, looks like a wildebeest was sitting on that petrified wood. Actually, it was some sewing thread. Like guided lightning versus natural lightning. We also, ball lightning is synonymous with the nucleus of an atom. There's actually quite a few videos now of ball lightning. But lightning guides, like of the enormous amount of high voltage, high amperage that's in a lightning strike, and countless thousands of people have been struck by lightning, but no one has ever talked about the fact that, and Dollard has mentioned this, not the specific point, that lightning is a discharge into counterspace. Most of the energy of a lightning strike, and it's not actually a strike, because these are Dollard's words, which are 100% accurate, a discharge into counterspace. When someone is struck by lightning, 99 point whatever percent is well over 99% of the current of a lightning strike, and it's not a strike like you're actually transferring energy from here to here. When someone is struck by lightning, most people actually survive. Many people, of course, do die. It arcs across the heart, and they're grounded. And many people have died from it, but countless numbers have lived. Most of the lightning strike does not pass through that person at all. The ground that we actually acknowledge relative to lightning, and lightning arresters and lightning rods that are actually grounded into the earth, most of the lightning strike does not actually reach ground or actually dissipate into ground. It's a complete and total discharge into counterspace. So taking 100% of a so-called lightning strike, which is not technically a strike, most of that is a discharge into counterspace. This is actually Eric Dollar's words, and it's actually something incredibly important to think about. It's a dissipation and discharge in the medium. They actually make called captured lightning. It's an art form where they actually bombard this plastic Lexan, which is that really thick, clear plastic stuff. They send it through this super high power X-ray machine, which is just wickedly deadly, through a conveyor belt. And when it reaches back out of the X-ray machine, they sell this stuff on eBay. It goes for like 50 to 60 bucks. It's very beautiful. They'll actually take a nail, which is grounded to a ground, and they'll actually put it on the edge of the Lexan block and tap it with a hammer so that it grounds out, but most of that is actually discharged into counterspace. What it does is it burns in this fern-like lightning strike pattern. Everybody finds it very beautiful, and it follows the golden ratio nearly perfectly. It's a perfect fractal algorithm of the discharge of dielectricity. Now, the people that actually make that say that they're actually draining electrons out of the Lexan. It's, of course, completely ridiculous. It's a discharge into counterspace, part of which is grounded, but it burns, it leaves little burn tracks in the plastic Lexan, and then, of course, they sell that as artwork. So this notion that lightning is a vertical discharge, which is grounded and most of the energy grounds, is ridiculous. I mean, That should be blatantly obvious to anybody who would think about it, because most human beings actually survive lightning strikes. So lightning is this discharge in counter space. Of course, the dielectric medium is discharged, and it actually vanishes into counter space. It's moved towards counter space. This is the exact same reason why all these so-called experts on field theory, vis-a-vis Heaviside, Steinmetz, Einstein, and relativists, they can never understand gravity because there's no electromotive force or any sort of induction, and it's also too instantaneous action at a distance. And you can't actually employ this brain-rotting mentality that it's an interaction between particles. That's completely ridiculous. They know it operates IAAD, instantaneous action at a distance. That's the reason why they still have no idea what gravity is. They call it spooky action at a distance. There's no electromotive force involved. There's no exchange of information through particles. I'd like to get into destructive light. So now we know what lightning fundamentally is. It's a discharge, most of which is a discharge in counter space. It's a dissipation of the energy storage of the dielectric torsion. It's between the ground and the clouds, and the tension that's actually created, which is a discharge in counter space. Most of that energy does not go to ground. And also, too, that so-called antimatter is not the inverse of matter, but just inverse phase of matter. No different than destructive interference in the case of the dual slit experiment, or constructive and destructive interference in the case of light. So in the case of destructive light, where does the light energy go? Well, it didn't go anywhere. We actually also, too, humanity suffers from this crazy idea that energy is never created. We've heard all this stuff growing up endlessly. Energy is never created or destroyed. It only changes form. And that's complete and total BS. A lot of energy in the early power line transmission, Steinmetz and Heaviside figured it out. It wasn't grounding or burning up systems. Enormous tonnages of energy, just enormous amounts, were lost. It didn't go anywhere. I mean, it would have left scorch marks. They would have identified where it grounded out. It literally vanished into counter space. Eric Dollard actually talks about this. Some other experts in field theory talk about this. In early AC power transmission lines, this is one of the reasons why Charles Peretti Steinmetz wrote Electrical Discharges, Waves, and Impulses. And he wrote a follow-up to that of Spurious Currents, and I forget the title of the book. It's on archive.org, which I know archive.org is being sued right now. I know all about that. Everybody keeps sending me emails about that. But the one thing that Mr. 2 PhDs couldn't figure out, and I have all the respect in the world for him, I love his books, they're so incredibly intelligent, is he can't figure out the fact that there's no causal link mentioned by James Clerk Maxwell into magnetomotive force, electromotive force. And the reason for that is because it's a conjugate reality between the magnetic and the dielectric. He never so much as suggests that the induced currents were a result of changing magnetic fields. On the contrary, he clearly associates the phenomena of electromagnetic induction with changing electrical currents. In other words, this idea of causation is absent, and he can't figure that out, and neither could anybody else before him. And the simple answer to that, because Mother Nature's a simple chick, wait for it, is because there is no causal relationship. The causation is not something separate or cause. It's extrinsic attribute of the conjugate system of the entire universe, which is conjugate between the magnetic and the dielectric. There is no causation in a principal attribute relationship. There is no North Pole versus a South Pole. North Pole and South Pole, in full extrapolation of what it truly is, of course, is the inverse of counterspace. When you have the creation of space, what do you think a torus creates? Imagine a torus, which starts from nothing, nearly a non-Cartesian point source of pure dielectricity in counterspace. Not that in counterspace is a very appropriate lexicon. When you have the expanding torus, if you will, which is kind of like an oblate balloon, what do you think that volume of the torus actually is? That is space, which has no properties. That's a direct quote from Nikola Tesla. When this is present, that is present. When you have the magnetic field, you have the impotency of energy. The absolute impotency or complete inversion of energy is space, the expanding toroidal geometry of the three-dimensional force vector that is magnetism, which is the centrifugal force, which is actual force, because gravity is not force. Gravity is the inversion of force. It is, of course, centripetal acceleration. Anyway, getting on to destructive interference. By the way, this was discovered 2 years ago, made the prediction several years ago, that they would find out that super high energy light created matter. So on the destructive interference in the case of dueling lasers, where they actually crossed and met at a point, the destructive force spontaneously generated matter. This is what happens on they're called galactic jets. There are also two called astrophysical jets, where trillions of tons, you go look up images, there's real images of astrophysical jets, also two called galactic jets, for the creation of hydrogen. Anyway, when these destructive interference between the ultra-high power radiation occurred from the lasers, which, by the way, are point source light emissions. Of course, this is the reason why lasers are so incredibly dangerous. Like I have a 5-watt blue laser. That sucker is just dangerous as hell. It'll burn your skin. It'll permanently blind you. It's like, what's the difference? It is not the qualitative nature, the quantitative nature of what it is. I say to people, it's like, why does magnetism fascinate people so much? Magnet is not quantitative, it is qualitative. Before a magnet becomes a magnet, it is 100% identical. What's happened is, of course, its qualitative nature has changed. A 5-watt light bulb impresses nobody. If you're like living in dirt, somewhere in, the desert, like if you had a 5-watt light, it was like, you'd complain because it's useless. You had a 5-watt laser, is incredibly useful, it's dangerous, it's powerful, it will blind you. 5 watts is 5 watts, what's the difference? Same thing with 5 sticks, right? You'll make a really crude analogy of a point source. Take 5 sticks, any child could break them, right? Not impressive. You tie them together, and they basically become unbreakable if they're thick enough. 5 sticks is not a lot, say 10, for example. Anyway, we have constructive and destructive interference, where laser light was seen to create matter. The energy is actually lost in counterspace. The destructive interference is either dissipated, or in the case of destructive interference, it spontaneously generated matter. Where light was amplified, there was later laser radiation, which was amplified. The actual visible light from laser radiation was amplified. Where light was absent, this was discovered 2 years ago, you go look it up. Where light was absent, there was the creation of matter. A spherical frequency, i.e. hydrogen. This is exactly what these black holes are emitting trillions and trillions of tons of. They're emitting hydrogen. I'm agreeing with the so-called scientists on this. They're emitting trillions of tons of gas, hydrogen. But hydrogen is just a silly human word for ultra-high energy light. I will also, too, quote Eric Dollard in one of his books. And this is a direct quote. I might get it super slightly wrong in the exact wording. It says, there's no way you could understand electrical theory without understanding counterspace. And he's exactly correct. To have a legend to understand, a legend or in the bottom corner of a map, a primer, a legend, it makes understanding things very simple. Without understanding counterspace, when you understand counterspace, you understand gravity. When you understand counterspace, you understand destructive interference. When you understand counterspace, you understand the creation of matter. When you understand counterspace, you understand that lightning is not a discharge from cloud to ground. That's BS. That's what human beings observe. Like, oh God, Bob was struck by lightning and nearly died. It's like, well, he was, but most of that energy didn't pass through Bob into the ground. It was actually a discharge of the medium into counterspace, because it's in dielectric medium discharge. No different than that X-ray bombarded Lexan sheets that they actually turn into art. So we explain in SIMPLEX antimatter, which is just inverse phase matter. We explain destructive interference of light, spontaneous creation of matter, i.e. hydrogen, through destructive interference, which was discovered, and I predicted many, many years ago, it was discovered 2 years ago using ultra-high power lasers, where the destructive interference manifested hydrogen. And it makes things really, really simple to understand. And it also, too, answers the one fundamental question that passes all through. This is a great book. One fundamental question that passes through this book, which is, well, there's no causal relationship. There is no causal relationship because it's not a cause, it's attribute. And the same is true of emanationism. Emanationism at its fundamental core is the opposite of creationism, where there's like original sin and first cause. There is no first cause in creationism. I mean in emanationism, excuse me, or the Greek word prohodos. It's attribute, which is not cause, but attributes. Like, what's the cause? There is no cause. So that's the answer to the big riddle that's asked many, many times by the author. Very brilliant man in this book, which is a great read, by the way. I hope I made some of that simple. I hope I didn't make it too complicated. If you ever want to contact me, my email's below. Have a lovely week.